UBC Law Professor, author, and harm reduction advocate Benjamin Perrin recently released a book called Indictment, The Criminal Justice System on Trial, and it is already the #1 bestseller in criminal law, criminology, and law enforcement on Amazon. When I heard about his book tour coming through Saskatchewan, I sent him an invite to the studio, and as a result, he's sitting here with me today. But before we get started, what's up, everybody? My name is Dan. This is Hard Knocks Talks, coming at you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Treaty Number 6 territory, and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. Hello, Ben.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm great.
Good. Thank you for joining me today. I know you're very busy. You have your event tonight. It's very exciting. I'm hoping to be there.
Awesome.
Is there anything that you'd like to say before we jump in today?
I'm just thrilled to be back on your show. It's great to be back in Saskatchewan and looking forward to our chat.
Awesome. Let's jump in.
This is Hard Knocks Talks.
Today's episode is premier sponsored by Prairie Harm Reduction. Prairie Harm Reduction is dedicated to reducing stigma and improving capacity for community care. One way they do this is by offering learning opportunities for professionals, businesses, and community groups. Training is available on several topics, including HIV, Hep C, harm reduction, engaging with people who use substances, and service navigation. To learn more, check out their website at www.prairiehr.ca or tap the link in the description below. If you are struggling with the substance use of a loved one or have tragically lost a loved one to drug-related harms, reach out to Stronger Together Canada, peer-led support groups by Moms Stop the Harm and or Naranon groups of Saskatchewan. If you are in search of private inpatient addictions treatment, check out Prairie Sky Recovery Centre located in Leipzig, Saskatchewan. To make contact or learn more about today's sponsors, check out our new merch, or if you want to show us some love and buy us a coffee, all of those links are in the show notes below. So, you were part of the Harper government's tough on crime policies, and the message you're carrying now is a far cry from that. What was your role at the time, and what was it that brought you to change your stance?
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I was Prime Minister Stephen Harper's lead criminal justice advisor and in-house legal counsel. And so that was a year of my life that I took off from my job at UBC as a law professor on leave and went there to mainly advise the government on issues related to victims of crime. That was my main area of focus. But of course, in that job, everything was on the table. That included, policing in Indigenous communities. That included harm reduction, and at that point, what was considered to be a crisis around the abuse of prescription medication. This is before the current unregulated drug crisis really got going, and everything in between. So it was a lot of very challenging, very interesting issues, a good chance to contribute. But, at that time, I was very much, at the front of the tough on crime parade. I thought that the system was too lenient, that we weren't treating crime tough enough, and that things like harm reduction were making things worse. So it was really driven by this toxic cocktail of like ignorance around these issues, really, and blinded by the ideology of the party at the time.
Did anyone in your life at that time, or perhaps before that time, struggle with substance use, or were you completely out of it on this one?
Yeah, they did, and yet that didn't change my views in any way. I had those hard-edged views, and I looked down at folks with some judgment, and tried to understand a little bit. Indictment actually starts and ends with the story of my father-in-law, Greg, and he struggled from a very, very young age, and all kinds of horrific childhood trauma he experienced. His father is a Chinese Canadian, a very well-known politician. His mother is a Métis woman, and he was dislocated from his mother at age 3 and sent to a boarding school at age 5, and life got worse from there. And so I've known Greg for over 20 years now. That's how long my wife and I have been together. First started dating back then. And the relationship that him and I had, he developed a addiction to alcohol, cannabis, crack cocaine. It was horrific, and we did not get along well. The most family gatherings would end with us having to leave because things were getting unsafe. And at one point we didn't even think he'd be able to attend our wedding. And so it was a very painful and difficult relationship. And so I have this sort of challenging situation in my personal life But then in my professional life, that didn't make me any more understanding. If anything, it hardened my heart in some ways.
Like, did it make things? Did it in some way justify your stance?
I didn't consciously connect those things, but I think it was just a really difficult, painful experience for me, and I didn't bother to really understand. I'd heard a little bit about he'd had a difficult childhood, but I was of the view at that point, I'm like, well, that doesn't matter, and it's today is today, and what's remarkable is that my father-in-law Greg and I now have an incredible relationship. He went through this amazing journey where as an Indigenous man who was dislocated from his traditions, he didn't really have much to go on. And, as his life was unraveling and he'd had run-ins with the police, he was arrested multiple times and was looking to get free of his addictions. He thought he was going to end up homeless, which was very likely to happen. His marriage was falling apart, obviously. And he decided that he was going to go out in the woods, in the wilderness in Kananaskis, Alberta. He took his 2 horses with him, Spirit and Cougar, and he went out on the land. And as he was about to leave for that trip, he saw a PBS documentary talking about Vision Quest. And he's like, that's what I'm doing. No one had ever told him, no one had taught him, but he just had this innate sense that he needed to be out and on the land, away from the things that were both triggering his substance use and away from the access to those drugs. And he was out there for 70 days. And it was a totally life-changing transformation for him.
So he must be versed in living off the land. This isn't right. Like,
he'd done a little bit of camping and stuff, but this was a real challenge. He had never, ever done anything like this before. Now his son would come and drop off supplies every now and then, but he had a, flip phone that you have to charge up at a gas station. But he was living in the forest in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was dangerous at times, but he began to really, as he describes, like really began to develop a sense of real self-esteem, and he would get more confident in the wilderness, and being in the creation around him, it totally changed him. And he came out of that a different person. I can tell you that he was the Greg I knew before that and the Greg after. And he attributes that to a couple things. One is his being on the land and connecting with his Indigenous, his roots as a Cree man, as a Métis man. That's his family history is from Young's Point in Manitoba, actually, is where his mother's from. And also his faith, his faith in Jesus. He was a Christian as well, like many Indigenous people are. And he just saw that being in the creation that God had made, it was so different for him to experience that. And so he got healing, and he wrote poetry. It was beautiful poetry. So the journey that I've had with Greg very much mirrors the journey that I've had in my own views changing. And so when I left politics and began to see people differently.
So
and
hang on a second.
Yeah,
now,
sure.
Before we get too carried or far away from this, I do want to know, what was it like a pinnacle realization that you had, like in your political life, in your political career? Tell us about, was it one moment where you realized like, whoa, like what we're doing here is not working?
So for me, that was around 2017 or so. So about 6 years ago. This is right around the time when British Columbia declared a public health emergency, when unregulated drugs eclipsed every other cause of unnatural death. And so I was actually driving to and from my job as a law professor at UBC, and hearing these story after story of individuals who had died. And, at that time they were still talking about like real people. They would describe who they were, the family they'd maybe left behind. It wasn't just statistics and figures. And it really bothered me that I had been part of this system, really, this like modern, didn't think of it this way, but it's the modern war on drugs, really. But that I had been part of a system that created the laws that under which thousands of people were now dying across Canada. And so I felt I had a moral responsibility to do something about that. And I, at the same point, kind of like my father-in-law, came to a point in my own life where I was going through my own midlife crisis. And it looked very different from his, but I was still really not, I was not coping well with life. And I was starting to go back to my own faith roots, much like Greg did. And so I pulled my car over, actually. I remember doing this, and where I did it in Vancouver on the way to work, hearing these stories of people dying. And I just prayed a very simple prayer. And I just said, like, God, give me a heart of compassion, because I didn't care. It bothered me that there were people dying in our community, and I didn't know them, but I also didn't seem to care.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the starting point, and that's when I started researching these issues. I started out with my last book, which is called Overdose, Heartbreak, and Hope in Canada's
There's
Opioid
an episode
Crisis.
on that one too. If you go back in our archive on YouTube, you can find our last episode with Ben. Check that one out.
Yeah, exactly. And it was actually talking to folks like Leslie McBain with Mom Stop the Harm, and people who use drugs, and police officers as well, who said the system wasn't working. I talked to public health experts. I went and visited overdose prevention sites and saw for myself what was happening, not just the scare and the panic that the media or right-wing politicians have around them. And through that, I started to understand how and why people are using substances, why people are dying, and what we could do about it. And so for me, it was, I had to have a soft heart before I could change my mind. That's really what it comes down to.
How was your new opinions met by your peers and colleagues and maybe even leadership?
Well, certainly, people kind of didn't know what to do with me because
They were
I'm a bit of an odd duck, right?
Yeah.
And it's been a really interesting journey. A lot of people are very interested because they're like, hey, if you were so convinced before of these other policies, and we'll talk more, I'm sure, about the other stuff, but drug policies, and then you're now arguing for decriminalizing people who use drugs and widespread access to safe places to use in our communities, and a regulated, safer supply, and rapid access to evidence-based treatment on demand, this kind of stuff. What's gone on there? So people started, looking at that, reading the book, and Overdose became a national bestseller. It's written for critics, right? Like each chapter is written with the questions that people either ask or are too polite to ask. Things like, well, doesn't it enable people to give them harm reduction services? And I tackle those head on with not just the research and stats, but like I said, the stories, the real lived experience stories that were so compelling for me to hear.
Yeah, I like to reflect on my own story. And when I look back, the legality of the substance or the availability of the substance had nothing to do with why I quit.
Yeah.
When we're talking about a regulated supply, I don't think that we should, and maybe you can speak to this briefly too, when we're talking about the regulation of alcohol, I personally, I don't believe that should be the benchmark for regulation of other supplies as well.
Sure.
What do you see there as far as what a regulated supply should look like?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting, theory on basically substances and approaches to them, and it's a bit of a kind of upside. It's like a smiley face, right? So, and the top represents the most harm to society, right? And on either side of that, so the highest harmful approaches is outright prohibition, and the other is commercialization. Okay.
I remember we touched on this the last time you were on the show.
Oh, did we? Okay, cool.
Yeah,
so I won't go over it too much then, but basically you have the most harms where you have a prohibition of a substance. In that case, you're handing it over to organized crime to produce it. That's what we have for fentanyl and heroin and cocaine and MDMA, ecstasy, you name it, all those substances. We have a legal prohibition model, and that's why we have so much harm. We have violence, we have murder, we have death, we have extortion, we have gangs. That is under a prohibition model. Think of Al Capone in alcohol prohibition. Yeah. The other side, because the reason I bring it up is you mentioned alcohol. Alcohol is very much under a commercialization model where it's actively promoted. There are
you can get all the different flavors.
Yeah,
and you can get grape flavored, and when we talk about that, that's like, is that what we want? Do we want grape flavored fentanyl?
No, and we saw something similar with like vaping and like the different flavors and all this. So and the critique around those are really marketed for kids, right? Adults may like them, but it's really drawing in youth, and there's some interesting documentaries on that now. So both commercialization at the one end and prohibition at the other are both harmful and not recommended. So what you want at the sort of minimizing harm at the very bottom is what's described as legal regulation. That means that the substances are produced with quality controlled standards, just like you would, for, meat, eggs, and poultry in your grocery store, right? Yeah. That if there is a contamination of the supply or someone dies because of it, there's an immediate product recall and you replace that with a safer supply. Yeah. So that's the starting point. And in terms of like who should be able to access it, that's another kind of question where we want to, be cautious. I am of the view that people who have who are going to use anyway, we want to be able to substitute a regulated, safer supply for them. And but we also don't want to make substances so widely available that people will be interested in just trying them out. I've always wondered what MDMA is like. Like, we don't want to get to that point. And so a regulated supply, but there's different ways to approach that, and there's really good research on that. So one example is compassion clubs. So these are folks who are already using substances, right? And
had Garth on the show just a little while ago,
great,
a couple weeks ago, talking about the Delph raid.
Yeah, I was there actually for the demonstration in Vancouver alongside Garth, and Man Mom Stopped the Harm, and as far as I could tell, maybe 400 or 500 people showed up for that, and really to voice our concern at the Vancouver police for arresting people who are literally saving lives. And I think it's really notable, just since we're on the topic, that the Crown has not yet laid charges, and I don't think they should.
I don't think they would be wise to.
Yeah.
That's and when they lay charges, it gives people, not unlike Garth, an opportunity to come into the courtroom and to fight. And like Garth said when he was on the show, he said every change that we've seen in drug policy over the last however many years has been a direct result of someone doing it without permission first.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And then they get charged, and then it goes to court, and then they fight and they win.
Yeah.
And then we see change.
Yeah. Well, and I'm someone so Garth is an outstanding activist. I'm someone who's a lawyer. I've worked at the Supreme Court of Canada, and I was Prime Minister's legal advisor. And I can tell you that while I don't want to speak light of it because it's being charged as a serious thing, and I don't wish that on the Delph leadership. But they have a lawyer who's been in the media. They clearly know what they're talking about. And if that were to happen, there's a very high chance that those charges would be stayed because of the public health emergency. And if not stayed outright, dismissed by the court, rather, is what I should have said. I can't imagine the police action in this case being at all constitutionally compliant, because essentially the way it works is the law is putting people in the position of either you comply with the law and you have access to a unregulated substance that is the leading cause of death of people ages 10 to 59 years old in British Columbia.
Wow.
So that's choice A. Okay. So comply with the law and risk death. Choice B is break the law and live. Break the law. Break the law. What that means is providing tested drugs to people so they know what they're getting, and the risk of death is substantially lower. And so when we see that classic dilemma, that is what the Supreme Court describes as you lack moral voluntariness. This is you should not be held. It's unconscionable to hold someone responsible. Example that this is a real case. Examples we talk about are, imagine you're up in the doing a mountain hike, and extreme weather comes in unexpectedly, and you see a cabin there, no one's in it, and you look in the window and there's a pile of wood and there's food and blankets. Your choices there are either to sit outside that cabin and freeze to death and die, comply with the law, or break in, light a fire, and live. And you're breaking and entering. And our law holds you not responsible. You're not guilty if you break into that cabin, if you are, in those types of circumstances. So, we're dealing with something much more serious than hypothermia risk here. This is a much more certain risk in a way. And so, so I do think there's a real problem with the fact that the VPD Vancouver Police proceeded in this way. It was highly politically pressured, and we have a very significant backlash in BC and other parts of Canada around harm reduction. And I think it's really important that we all speak out about that.
Do you think there's a bigger, now I don't want to go down the conspiracy rabbit hole here or anything, but I can't help but wonder, knowing what you know, and the VPD, I mean, they're not stupid, why do you suppose they went ahead with this? They must have realized that in all likelihood it would be stayed.
Well, the way it works in BC is unlike a province like Ontario. In Ontario, the police can actually lay charges. In BC, they can't. So their decision is to arrest and recommend, and then it's out of their hands, and the Crown has to do a review. So they know the Crown has to do a review. The two main criteria for charge approval in BC, it's a bit different than other parts of Canada. There has to be a substantial likelihood of conviction. So we just talked about how there probably isn't there. And it has to be in the public interest. And it is absolutely not in the public interest to to choose to prosecute Compassion Club members and leadership who are saving lives. And so, the rationale for why the VPD went forward, it is not consistent with their previous approaches to charging in drug trafficking cases at all. And so when we look at their stated policies, and then they were asked to justify, well, why did you go after these Compassion Club leaders? They made outrageously laughable statements that they'd already done such a good job of addressing illicit trafficking in the city that now they had time to go after these folks. And no one buys this. No one's buying that argument. They also went after, people will maybe have heard about Dana Larson's, mushroom dispensaries as well. In the same, week or two, they went after him as well. And the thing about Dolph and Mr. Larson is they're both operating in plain sight. There's no secrecy around this. And in fact, with Dolph, they had gone through multiple steps with public health organizations and publicly spoken about what they were doing. They had even sought and asked for federal support from Health Canada for exemptions. They were not given them. And so again, is there a public interest in pursuing a criminal prosecution against these individuals? Absolutely not.
So in your latest project, it started with a handwritten letter from somebody who was incarcerated. Tell us about that, and what position were you holding at the time of this letter?
So this is about 5 years ago. So I was in the midst of doing this research on the drug crisis, and I get this letter, and it's, when people get really desperate, they contact a criminal law professor. I'm not practicing law, so don't get ideas to do this now. What I do is
Please don't email me.
No, I won't. I'm not full-time research and teaching and all that, right? So what I do is I'll usually say, oh, here's a legal aid organization, or here's a person who works in that area, please contact them, and I'll move on with my day. That's really easy to do. This letter did not let me have that easy way out. This man did not ask me for anything. He simply wanted to tell his story. And the letter was like a 2x4 over the head. There was one line in particular, as he just shared his story, that really hit me hard. He said, if you want to turn a man into an animal, put him in a cage without the resources to build him back up. And I didn't know what to do with the letter. I put it aside. I kept coming back to it. Around the same time, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was the first Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, launched this big public consultation. One of the questions they asked was, if you could design a new criminal justice system from scratch, what would it look like? So I have this letter from this Indigenous man and this question from the Justice Minister, and that's what was the spark for this new book, Indictment.
In your book, you talk about transformative justice. Why do you think we should abolish the prison system? I mean, to me, when I hear that, and when I look at that from a very topical level, and perhaps I would be so bold as to say an uneducated level, I think you cannot abolish the prison system. There are a lot of people out there that simply want to watch the world burn.
Sure. Yeah.
So what does that mean when you talk about abolition of our prison system? Unpack that. How does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So the kind of approach that we're taking currently, we got to contrast it. So what have we got right now? So what we have right now is a system of essentially three things: policing, punishment, and prison. So that's how we're dealing with not just criminal incidents, but homelessness, poverty, mental health issues, substance use, and inequality. So we throw police, punishment, and prisons at those problems. So much of what the police deal with is not criminal in nature. There was actually a report this past week out of Alberta where they were reporting back on the expansion of the sheriffs. There was concern about crime in the public transit system in Alberta. So they brought in these sheriffs to patrol along with police officers to sort of expand the law enforcement presence.
Like sky marshals almost?
Yeah, well, they were on all the C-train routes in Calgary, and they had their cowboy hats and uniforms on and all this, right? And the whole idea was we're going to be tough on crime. We're going to crack down on it and supposedly make people safer. They found two major findings. One was, and this isn't my study, this is their own study, okay? Number one is they had no impact on reducing crime. None, okay? And number two, they found that 55% of the calls for service that they were receiving were non-criminal in nature. Okay. So the starting point is most of what our criminal justice system is dealing with are actually not criminal issues at all.
So give us an example. What were they being called for?
They get called for someone who's sleeping on a C-train platform. Someone at a bus stop who's got a cardboard box that they're laying on in a sleeping bag. Someone who is has drug paraphernalia on them, someone who appears to be intoxicated, which could actually just be someone in a mental health issue, by the way, as well. So public intoxication, loitering, causing a disturbance, someone who's swearing and yelling, maybe having a mental health episode. Those are the kinds of calls that they were mainly getting. And what the research shows, and we'll talk about abolition of traditional police. I'm not saying that, but other ways to do policing and abolishing traditional jails. But this is the starting point, is that those people then get caught up in the system. And we find that when the police are interacting with folks who are with substance use or mental health issues, they're far more likely to be charged with less serious offenses. That's what the research shows. But they're also more likely to have force used against them, and they're more likely to die in police encounters. So 68% of people who died in police encounters throughout Canada in the last 20 years, 68% were experiencing mental health or substance use issues at the time. It's an absolutely staggering figure. When we get into the prison system, what we see is between 70 and 93% of people have a substance use disorder. Absolutely massive number of folks. Huge numbers of undiagnosed and diagnosed mental health issues, well over half to 3/4 of folks. Massive overrepresentation of Indigenous people. We've got 32% of federally incarcerated people in Canada are now Indigenous. And within the provincial system in provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's between 70 and 80%. So when people are sent to jail, whether it's for a crime or whether they're just charged and they're awaiting trial, they tend to get worse and not better.
Yeah.
Right. And so what happens is if they had a home, they may lose it, especially if it was supportive housing. If they were being seen by maybe a assertive community treatment for mental health, so this is like intensive mental health support.
That's gone now.
They're gone. Yeah, it's gone. If they had a job, try explaining why you're not at work on Monday, right? You're going to lose that. And it can disrupt your relationships too, your family, your partner, and what you're, back in jail again. We don't know what to do with you.
Yeah.
Then what happens is you're going to get out eventually and you're going to be on conditions. Yeah. And one of the conditions is going to be that you abstain from using substances.
Yeah.
And as I just said, that's most people have literally the definition, as you know, of a substance use disorder is despite wanting to stop or use less, you're unable to. It's a chronic condition in many ways, right?
Likely not have had access to evidence-based programming while incarcerated.
That's right.
They just expect somehow being locked in a cage cures addiction.
Yeah, exactly. And we know actually from the research too that sending someone to prison with a substance use disorder, like opioid use disorder, it's like a death sentence for many people by 50 times, not 50% more likely, 50 times more likely.
And why is that?
Well, it's because someone's tolerance rapidly goes down when you're in a period of reduced access to substances or outright, flat out detox, right? Abstinence only, right? Which is not medically recommended. And so that tolerance is going down and down and down, even though there is drugs of all kind in prison, which brings massive violence. You have way less access. And so then when someone's released, the research we did, we talked to folks. So people told me, when I got out of prison and they were like, I knew that was an issue. I'm not Stu. I knew that. And one man I spoke to said, I looked at what I would normally use and I cut it so small because I just got out of jail. And he said it was like a crumb and he thought he was wasting his time. It wasn't going to give him any kind of buzz at all. He took it and he was almost immediately unconscious. And fortunately, there was someone there to revive him. But even someone who was aware of that risk, underestimated how serious that risk was. So our prisons and jails, and getting back to your question, why we need to abolish these traditional prisons and jails, and then what do we do instead, is that they are costly, they're financially costly and socially costly, they're ineffective, they actually increase recidivism, reoffending, and they're deadly. They increase overdose risk, suicide risk. They leave you without a job and with a criminal record, and
no resources to regain these things. They and here's something that I've been talking about with some friends of mine is they know that you don't have ID. They know that you don't have a health card. They know that you don't have references or any of these tools that you need to reintegrate yourself into society. Yeah. And they don't do anything about it.
People tell us they were released in prison shoes, like you say, with no ID. In a community they didn't live in and didn't know anyone. Most people are brought in from, far-flung places and put in these places of incarceration at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon with nowhere to go.
On a Friday.
Yeah. And people wonder why they would like break into a vehicle and sleep in it. We are literally setting them up for failure. Yeah. And we're setting ourselves up for failure as a society too. And then they end up back in on breaches, and the cycle repeats. One person that we spoke to, this is the first person who responded to our research poster. We give everyone a pseudonym to protect their privacy. In the book, I call her Courtney. If people are reading the book, they'll be able to hear more. And between the ages of 12 and 39, 12 and 39, she was 39 when I spoke to her. She was in and out of juvenile, provincial, and federal institutions of all security classifications. 25 years in total, she added it up. 25 years of her life, starting at age 12. So, it is absolutely devastating to folks like her, whose lives did begin with horrific trauma that was never addressed. And we try to punish them to get them to, quote unquote, learn their lesson.
Punish the trauma out of them.
Yeah, it's so cruel. And it of course, re-traumatizes it. So that's why I describe this as transformative justice. Our goal shouldn't be to punish people. That's what the current system is. It's at its core, it is a punitive, retributive system. Retributive means you hurt someone, so we're going to hurt you back. Instead, we need to transform the trauma in our society, both the trauma of people who, in the cases of where there is a victim, if someone's been assaulted or harmed, we need to support them. The current system doesn't really do that at all. It treats them like a piece of evidence. And we interviewed survivors and victims who talked about that. So transforming their trauma, but also transforming the trauma of people who caused harm. There's a saying, hurt people, and it's true. And so if we're interested in a safer society, we need to do things different. So what do we do though? Like you say, when someone is a serious risk, we cannot have them just at large in the community. There are people like that. Absolutely. So we looked at other jurisdictions and what do they do? And we looked at, in particular, in Norway, there's a number of institutions now, but one of the most well-known is called Halden. And in the early 1990s, Norway went through a massive national reckoning. There were a bunch of prison riots. Some guards were killed. And they had a system very much like ours, a traditional Victorian era, lock you up behind bars, let you out to have meals and some activities, and then lock you up again. And,
and then wonder why you're so violent and angry.
Yeah. And with other people too, right? Where you're getting traumatized and re-traumatized. So they decided to do things totally differently. They said, we're going to organize our new system around one question, one central question. And it's the same question I think we should ask. It's, what kind of a neighbor do you want? Because these folks are going to get out. And so what they did is they created what's been described as the most innovative and humane approach to corrections in the world. And when you look at Halden Prison, from the outside, it looks like any other prison. It's big walls. People are not getting out. So to your point, they're taken out of society for a time because it's not safe for them to be around other folks in society. But inside, it's completely different. It looks like the Apple campus. Literally the rooms look like a college dorm that I had at University of Toronto. Like, it looks exactly like that. And they have, what are they doing? Instead of people joining gangs and violence around the drugs that are smuggled in, they're getting counseling. They're getting evidence-based substance use support and treatment. They're getting vocational training in areas where there is jobs needed. They're smaller institutions, so they're closer to their families. They have regular family visits. And the guards don't just have a high school diploma and are trained on use of force, which is mainly how it works here, but what they call them contact officers, are meant to be mentors. They support just 2 to 3 residents in Halden. And their goal is, they say most prisons are designed to keep you in. Our goal is that you don't come back.
Get you out.
Yeah, we want to get you out. So the results really speak for themselves. Like, people can look at this and go, some media I've done interviews with say, oh, I can hear the attack ads now. Like, oh, this is soft on crime, hug a thug stuff. And I said, hey, forget.
Hug.
Yeah. I said, forget, if it rhymes, it's going to work, right? That's the way it works these days. I said, we need to make one place like this in Canada. Start with one, just to show people that it works, and don't shy away from it. In my public talks and stuff, when I can, I show photos, and I actually show on one slide, there's a photo of people who've committed very violent crimes in Halden doing pottery. It's a beautiful pottery. And then on the other side, it shows the reoffend rates. They used to be 60 to 70% in Norway, just like in Canada, same rates. It went down to 20%. 20%. So I say, don't hide from it. Put it in the front window and say, what is going to make people healthier and reduce the risk of them reoffending? What is a place to get healing? And that's what you do. You have to treat people humanely, and you will get safer communities. And so that's what I talk about when I say abolishing traditional prisons. We take a very different approach. It'll be far less people separated from society.
I'm interested to know what their release protocols are. Like with us, we were just talking about people are walking down the street in prison shoes.
Yeah.
When they're released from the institutions that you were just describing, I wonder what happens to them then.
Yeah. So they have a pretty seamless, porous sort of entry to the institution. So people are coming into the institution and they're getting to know them and meet them and work with them. And so many folks are getting training and contacts in the community already, so that it's not this shock when you go out. It's not the inside and the outside, that there's a lot more back and forth, as it were. And the whole purpose of the contact officers is to develop the plan for release. And what does that look like? And I'm not sure the follow-up that they do, if it's those contact officers or somebody else, but that's really key. I talked a little bit of employment. I just want to emphasize how big a deal that is. Okay. So yeah. So in Canada, what the research shows is that the average person who goes to federal prison was unemployed at the time of arrest, and they follow them 14 years after release. So 14 years after they were released from federal custody, the average person had $0 as their income. So it's like a life sentence to unemployment and poverty. And look, we just know when people are more desperate, if you don't have money, and you're gonna be in a more desperate place. And we know that that's when people can be drawn into criminal activity a lot more easily. And I think we could all understand why that would be. We've heard about people who have literally been caught stealing food. When I was a student, law student, working in downtown Toronto, one of the clients that I represented was a young Black woman, and her charges were, stealing underwear from Winners. Like these are necessity items. It's not like a luxury. It's not like stealing a Rolex from a smash and grab. I mean, these are crimes of being a poor person in a society that doesn't provide us with the most basic human needs. I've heard young Indigenous people talk about stealing food to feed their families. And so I think it's really notable that when we look back and say, how did we get on this path of like these huge prisons and a modern police approach? Like, why did we go down the road of police punishment and prisons to begin with? And it actually goes back to Victorian England. And interestingly, at that time, what the problems were that they had: Industrial Revolution's taken off, massive social inequality, skyrocketing inflation. Does sound familiar, right? Unscrupulous landlords. Literally, that's from the historical record. It talks about that. And people, hear about sleeping rough and like literally sleeping on those ropes and like trying to lay in the streets. And the modern police force in the prisons essentially full of people who were committing crimes related to poverty, vagrancy, and poverty. And that's how we got started on this road. And that is what we're seeing now with these underlying social issues flaring up again. We're seeing increased crime rates, increased homelessness, and increased unregulated drug deaths.
Before we move away from corrections, I'm interested to know, and this popped into my head, so this is random. What are your thoughts on the compassionate intervention strategy they're implementing in Alberta?
I think any idea to force someone into treatment is really dangerous. The research shows that forced treatment is associated with higher rates of death. And I always ask people, what do you mean by forced treatment? Do you mean you are physically going to hold someone down and inject Suboxone into them? Are you going to force them to take methadone? Is that what you mean by forced treatment? Or do you mean, because that's clearly not okay. That's a violation of your bodily integrity and is no doubt unconstitutional. Or do you mean you're going to coerce the treatment? You're going to threaten them that if they don't take the treatment, you're going to lock them in jail. Well, we just covered how sending someone to prison increases their death chances by 50 times. So that's out. Whatever version of forcing someone into it, or if it's lock you in a room and do a forced detox, that's associated with higher death rates as well. We know that people who are only go cold turkey for opioid use disorder in particular, which what I'm familiar with from the research, are more likely to die than someone who doesn't go through that process. And that's true of, like a 28-day straight up detox as well. So So I have a lot of big concerns. There's no evidence to support involuntary or forced treatment. It doesn't work, and it's a political ploy. The fact is we don't have access to free treatment. When people say they want access today to evidence-based treatment, they often, more often than not, can't get it.
End up on a wait list.
Yeah, and I talked to folks who were put on
go steal a car.
6-month wait lists. Yeah, and the folks will have their own timelines with their own experience around how long they kind of the window of opportunity was open for them to enter. But when I spoke to some leading people in public health and addiction medicine about what their understanding was, I was shocked at how short the window was. They said 2 hours.
Yeah,
2 hours. The
We're
optimal
an
window.
impulsive bunch, man.
I get it though.
When we need help. I mean, we want it right now.
Yeah.
And just that, I don't know why we're not capitalizing on that.
Yeah.
But when I say it's, you bring up an interesting point. We can't get free treatment, but we can get free treatment if we get arrested.
How twisted is that, right?
Yeah.
And this is part of what I talk about in Indictment is the criminal justice system has expanded its tentacles into all these areas where it has no business being. And so this is an example that we're talking about in the substance use and addictions world. We also see it with displacement and homelessness. We see the police being actively and integrally integrated in the decampments of people who are living in literally in tents under tarps and in cardboard boxes. We visited an encampment yesterday, which is also a protest camp as well. It's in the shadow of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, and it also they have a sacred fire lit in honor of the missing and murdered, and a call for more to be done to address that issue. And so, we have people who are doing this and promoting what are really important inequalities in our society, and we also have people who have been displaced because of the high cost of living. I mean, we've got new reports today about the increasing rent costs, and
oh man,
it's crazy.
We're a family of 4 here, and this is not an extravagant flat we've got here. We're comfortable. We have what we need. I'm not trying to say we don't.
Yeah.
But man, the cost to live here and the cost to eat and everything for a family of 4, I'm not even going to spit out the numbers, but it's crazy, man.
Yeah.
Like it's crazy.
Yeah. When we know people can't do it, can't make it work. We, some of the folks that we hear about as well at, even you think like a good universities, like, UBC, you think, oh, people must have a lot of money to go there. Well, it turns out when universities have tried to shut down like study space, because, we got to save some money or we don't have staff to keep the library open 24/7. Students have protested and appealed to say, keep them open. And it wasn't because they want to study at 4 a.m. It's because they have nowhere else to go. So we literally have students, imagine trying to learn, who are literally sleeping in cubicles in study spaces and then going to shower at the, rec center at the university. People living in their cars. Right. And then getting threatened with being towed. And those are just folks that are in education. We also know that there are families and people who are living in tents, tarps under, the bridges and in the alleyways, what have you. What happens is when the police get involved in what is a issue of lack of housing affordability, and they then take the only thing that you have and literally throw it in the garbage. That's what we had happening in Vancouver.
Yeah.
It leaves you so much more vulnerable because you were already in a tough spot, and now you have nothing that night when it's going to rain and it's going below zero and starting to snow.
Let's talk about the cost of the police involvement. What's the cost of that raid? Going in there and having all of those law professionals, whatever, going in there and displacing everyone. And where do they think that these people are going to go? People need a place to put their body. It's like physics. You can't just not exist.
Well, that's actually what some people are saying is the ultimate outcome here, is that they don't exist because they're gone. Yeah. And it's the same thing that, as more and more years have passed around unregulated drug deaths, people literally dying. And there were stats that I saw out of Alberta last year, I don't know if Saskatchewan keeps them too, of the number of people who literally froze to death and the number of people who had amputations of fingers and toes because of frostbite. Right. And they were going up. Now, the cost of a 1 week street sweep, as they're called, in Vancouver along Hastings Avenue, the numbers came out. We have a new tough on crime mayor who promised 100 new police officers, and we're paying higher record-breaking property taxes now, to pay for this unethical and harmful approach. It was $500,000 for just 1 week of those street sweeps. And they're still doing them. Right after we talked about the protests in Vancouver around the arrest of Dolph leadership, there was a protest for that. And as I was walking back to my car, I saw going down East Hastings, there were 3 vehicles, right? Number 1 in the lead was a garbage truck, the same garbage trucks that come and take my trash from my house. Number 2 was a dump truck, the ones that they use for when a house gets demolished to build a mansion that someone may not even live in. They take away the old house and they ship it out to the dump. And number 3, there was a police car. And these 3 vehicles, the garbage truck, the dump truck, and the police cruiser, up and down, up and down. They'd already cleared the streets. They are looking for anyone who's starting to put up a tent, a tarp, or some kind of structure they could sleep in. It's so cruel. You know, it gets even worse. The cities like Barrie, we're trying to make it not criminal, rather a bylaw offense to give someone food or water from a public property, and they were shut down. This was not that long ago. This was a few months ago, and it drew a national outcry. The campaign against that bylaw was led by a really amazing mom from Mom Stop the Harm.
Which one?
Christine Naylor. Yeah. Shout out to her and her team. Angela Voss also involved in that, a couple other incredible people. And so it just really shows how cruel our society has become when we're turning the law not only on homeless people, but on those who would help and support people in need. And with substantial fines. You know, these were not rinky-dink tickets. It gets worse, though. When we were doing further research, we found that here in Saskatchewan, police have gone undercover, posing as homeless people at the side of the road. And when you give them change, and you turn around thinking you've done your good deed for the day, the lights come on from a police cruiser, and you get charged with, I don't know if it's distracted driving or what the charge is, but it's a ticket. It's like $150, $200 ticket. And CTV exposed this, someone who had actually donated to the homeless person, in quotes, and was shocked to find it was an officer. And when the police were asked to respond to this, they said, well, this is a routine thing that we do.
Where does the money that gets handed over go?
Yeah, great question. Great question. You know, I'm in town right now. I should probably go hit the bank. I would love to get one of those tickets and film that interaction.
Maybe
if you have
we
any.
should go and do that now.
Yeah, you know, honestly, I'll pay the money, you know. And the reason I don't speak flippantly about this, I'm a firm believer of what Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi believed. You need to, you know, in a non-violent way, break unjust laws, and that is what the history of harm reduction has been.
Garth Mullins says that too.
Yeah, and that's he's in good company, right? Yeah. So you know, and I don't say it flippantly. I think there are costs to be paid that people pay for those things. We know that it was not cost free for either of those three men. But at some point we have to ask the question of, like, what kind of a society are we becoming? And it's you know, I'm not okay with that. I think the cruelty towards folks is driven by, you know, hard hearts and feelings that we're better than other people. And I used to think that I did. I thought I'm here because I worked hard. It's not. I work hard, but you know, it's not that. I did not have the childhoods that the people I interviewed for my book have had. Yeah, I had a relatively safe and happy, certainly a safe and happy home. I had some challenges in my schooling and that, but you know, nothing remotely compared to the things that I heard people experienced who ended up developing substance use disorders, who became homeless, who became caught up in the criminal justice system. And so we need to have a lot more understanding for where folks have come from and where they're going. But there is hope. And we do see people who go through, you know, as you know, and you talk, this is why we're here talking, you know, both of us have gone through, like my grandfather or my father-in-law, Greg, you know, remarkable changes, and we can get a new life and make these contributions and, you know, I've, you know, used the mess that was before and help others and be able to speak out like that. So that's one of the reasons that I'm, you know, here talking to you, is that I made some big mistakes in my life, you know, and I want to spend the time that I have, however long that is, you know, none of us knows how long we've got. I want to spend that time advocating for compassion for people, for following, you know, evidence around what's going to work, not just political sound bites and rhymes, and to support people who are doing good. There are people, and each of the 7 chapters in the second half of my book Indictment. It's not just neat ideas. It profiles real people and real organizations that are making a positive change, including like right here with Straight Up, which is a organization, you might know about them, who is heavily involved in helping people exit in gang life.
We had their co-founder, Andrei Polyev.
Andrei, yeah.
Yeah, he was on the show. He was sitting in that exact chair 2 weeks ago.
Awesome. Yeah. So he's in my book too.
Cool.
And the proceeds from our book actually are all of the author royalties are being directly donated to Straight Up and to a collaborative justice initiative in Ottawa, which does restorative justice.
In the process of writing this book, you interviewed many people. Were there any overarching themes when it came to substance use and justice?
Yeah, it was definitely a few that come to mind. One was how young folks who got involved in the justice system began using substances, and it's directly linked to their childhood trauma. Directly linked. And the youngest that I heard someone became addicted to a substance in our study was someone who's 5 years old. Alcohol. Multiple people, 9, 10, 11, 12, things like heroin, cocaine, meth, and it went from there. And so that's the first one, is that, childhood trauma, the link between childhood trauma and adult substance use and mental health issues has been described as closely and tightly proven as the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right? So we now know that. The other one was how the system sets them up to fail. Sets them up to fail through abstinence orders and conditions that they not use a substance they're addicted to. So that starts the cycle. We also saw how, because they don't have access to a regulated, safer supply, they're forced to engage with people who are
they're not supposed to engage with.
Yeah, and it could be, it could lead to violence against them, or it could lead them to, and it's also monopoly prices, right? So they're getting involved. Some folks, not everyone, but some folks would get involved in theft, or they would end up being offered, hey, by their deal, hey, you seem a nice person, why don't you sell 10 hits and you can have one for free, And so then now they're getting charged as drug traffickers, and that's how they take big jail time then. And so this escalation really, right, occurred. And I would say the third thing is, of the people that we spoke to, we were only speaking to people who were alive. The folks who were deceased, we couldn't hear their stories. And so, we heard from family members, and we heard from fellow incarcerated people about people who had died in custody or at halfway houses. And they were, at this point, how do we know who dies and who doesn't? It's been described as Russian roulette, right? I don't think that anyone, there's no way certainly to predict it. And so the people who I spoke to talked about, in one case, a man, this was really tough to hear. He talked about how a fellow incarcerated person, while they were in a provincial jail, was overdosing and was unconscious and stopped breathing. And this man who I interviewed, this fellow inmate, was frantically trying to give him CPR and calling for the guards to come and help. And people, they didn't come in time, and that person passed away. But he tried to save him. So we're really failing people, and with Indigenous people, it is so. It's so glaringly obvious to me that if we're going to look at judging people, we should really be judging ourselves as a settler society. I say that as a white settler. I mean, it's, as Harold Johnson said, who's was from here in Saskatchewan, late Harold Johnson, a Cree man, and was a Crown prosecutor and defense lawyer, wrote a really great book called Peace and Good Order: The Case for Indigenous Justice, and another book called Firewater: How Alcohol is Killing My People and Yours. He says essentially there's sort of three moves that the settlers made. First was to create the trauma and the harm against Indigenous people, the residential schools, the 60s scoops, the criminal justice system. It creates the pain. Then it provides the solution to numb out that pain, alcohol and other substances. And then it punishes Indigenous people for using those things. So colonialism creates the pain, it gives the solution, and it punishes for taking that. And that's just an incredible indictment against the way that our system is treating Indigenous people who use substances, out of what the origins are is the harm done against them. And so, there are people who are getting help and getting support, but the programs, all of them that we found, whether it was restorative justice programs, whether it was Indigenous healing lodges, whether it was straight up, whether it was, all of them, they're all chronically underfunded.
Yeah.
They're hand to mouth looking for donations. And they get independently reviewed, and they're found to have lower rates of reoffending, higher rates of victim satisfaction, but they're starved of funding. And yet we have funding for more police officers, and we're talking about building more jails.
We're building a giant remand center right here in Saskatoon as we speak. It's going up.
Absolutely sick. It's absolutely sick. And that is an example of the biggest failing you should have. There should be a moratorium on building any more places of custody. We know who's going to be locked in there. Mm-hmm. It's all the vulnerable groups we talked about. Look, if I got charged with the exact same offense as someone who was some combination of being Indigenous, Black, or a person of color, had a substance use issue, was experiencing poverty or homelessness, had a mental health issue. Pick any two of those, okay? And you compare me against them. We did the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. My chances of being, first of all, detected for doing it are way lower, okay? Arrested are lower, charged are lower, being convicted are much lower. If we are convicted, I'm going to get a lower sentence. And we can prove that and walk through it. It basically is why we have systemic racism. What that means is because I'm able to say, hire a lawyer, start with that. I'm going to I don't have the money sitting in my bank account either, but I will go to the bank and I'll say, hey, take out some home equity, give me $25,000, and I'm going to go and give that money as a retainer to a top criminal defense lawyer. Mm-hmm. And they're going to pick apart whatever case the Crown has, and they'll be ready for negotiating a good deal for me. In the meantime, they're going to tell me what to do. They're going to say, oh, if it was like something about anger, they'd be like, you're going into counseling for anger management.
Stay off social media.
You do all that. Yeah. You're going to make a full apology to the person you threatened or whatever it was, Mm-hmm. They're going to craft me. Notice this is not genuine remorse. They are going to craft me into being the most outstanding offender possible. Mm-hmm. They're then going to have a whole docket of this stuff. They're going to have letters of reference and all the people who say what a great person I am. They're going to bring that to the Crown. There's no judge involved even, right? 90% of all criminal charges get resolved through a plea agreement. Okay. And they're going to say to the Crown, look, you do not want to go ahead with this guy. And they'll throw in something like, we actually think there's probably some weaknesses in your case too. And just so you know, we've done the analysis. We think you don't have a very strong case. But, Mr. Perrin, just to let you know.
Just saying.
Yeah. But, Mr. Perrin's agreed to make a $10,000, making this all up, right? In case people are tuning in now, it's all fictional. They would tell me to make a $10,000 donation to a women's help center, and he's willing to do that in return for the charges being withdrawn. And this is a right case for diversion, first time offender. The Crown needs this off their desk. They are going to go for it unless it's a really serious case and they perceive that there's a risk of further harm. I'm going to completely walk. Mm-hmm. So basically a checkbook. Whereas if that was someone who did not have that lawyer, they're going to be and faces one of those or more marginalizing factors, they're going to be denied bail. They're going to be sitting in a remand center where they have no access to programs, where they're experiencing violence. Mm-hmm. And chances are they might even serve more time in remand waiting to go on trial
than they would have otherwise locked up.
You got it. So what do? What's the incentive? It's to plead out. Mm-hmm. You plead guilty so that you walk out the door. Mm-hmm. And you do that, now you have the criminal record and you'll have conditions and you're going to high chance of breaching those. When we drill down too, and we look at, how is it that people end up back in jail? Well, it turns out for Indigenous people who are incarcerated, that if they end up back in prison, it's more likely to be from violating conditions like a breach of curfew mm-hmm. or a abstinence order than it is for committing a new crime. Mm-hmm. So we have a completely skewed understanding of, who the perpetrators are. Because of these massive inequalities in the system. It is not a justice system. Mm-hmm. It is a legal system, right? It is not a justice system. It is profoundly unjust. And that's why we put the system on trial in this book. And don't just leave it there, but, just to show people like there are new and better ways that we can address harm in our society. And that's through transformative justice approaches.
Mm. A couple of minutes ago, you were talking about police are doing things that police have no business doing.
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about 24/7 non-police mobile crisis response teams. Tell us more about how you see that reducing community harms.
Yeah, so this is a really cool program that's been building over the last several decades. There's now over 200 communities across North America that have either piloted or done a full-scale implementation of non-police crisis response. So when you call 911, in most places, you only get 3 options, right? It's like police, fire, or ambulance. This is giving a 4th option, which is a support worker. Okay. In Toronto right now, they have that. They have blown that up into at least 4 communities. And so it's new. It's been piloted and they're seeing it's working and builds up. It's something that started, one of the earliest programs was in Oregon. It's a group called CAHOOTS, which stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. So what happens is instead of just being police, fire, and ambulance, 15 to 20%, it's like 1 in 5 of all the 911 and non-emergency police calls in Eugene, Oregon, go to non-police crisis workers. So they're patched into the 911 system. They got the radios and everything, and they go and they respond to about 28,000 calls a year instead of police. Wow. It's a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so instead of an armed police officer with the full kit in the car showing up, it is someone who's in plain clothes. They'll have like a hoodie on with the logo, and they've got like they look like they're carrying like a backpack or a medic pack, and they go in and they talk to people. They're not armed. They can call for police backup if they want to, but the number of times that happens is incredibly rare. And so what are the kinds of things they're responding to? I'll give you an example. So let's imagine a business owner goes to open their shop in the morning, and there's someone who's displaced, who's sleeping in the underneath to stay dry or sheltered somewhat from the elements in the doorway. Right now, that's not a fire. The ambulance isn't going to do anything. There's no need for medical treatment. So the default is police.
Yeah, and the laws being broken there are frivolous,
if at all.
Yeah,
if at all. And so the instances of police use of force and just even a lack of compassion against people in those situations, they come up and they happen, and they then get into, well, who are you? Let's see your ID. Oh, you're on warrants, or you're shuffling around, something falls out of your pocket. Is that drugs? And things move from there. Once there's contact with police, things can move very quickly. We had a case in Vancouver. It's under investigation still, but it's exactly the description I gave of a business owner. They called for someone to help, and police came. The business owner was shocked at how the police responded. The allegation is that the VPD went and kicked the homeless person and allegedly told them to get a job that they were entitled, and if they didn't move, they were going to jail.
Wow.
And the complaint wasn't made by the homeless person. The complaint was made by the business owner who witnessed this and was horrified, and even went as far as to tell the media that they had their best friend is actually a police officer. They're not some like anti-police activist. But this experience, they didn't feel safe even calling the police after that. So, that kind of experience is unfortunately not uncommon, and if not that extreme, but just to be treated harshly. Instead of someone, imagine coming and saying, hey, can see it's a cold night last night, this person's got to open up, it's 10 o'clock. You need somewhere to stay. We can take you somewhere, or even just come in the van. We're going to warm you up. We've got the heat on. Yeah. Get you some food.
Here's some coffee.
Yeah. Here's a cup of coffee. Yeah. And the thing we found in interviewing folks who are in that kind of situation is they have been treated like garbage. They've been mistreated, abused. They've been dehumanized for so long. And when one person shows them kindness and compassion, it can not only change their day, but it can change their whole life. Like we've literally had people who, when they tell their stories and now they're doing these incredible things, they will talk about often. There's a pivotal moment of one person who came and offered that cup of tea. That's like literally a case that I can think of now. Yeah. Someone who, I'll tell one good police officer story so people are clear. It's not just like an anti-police thing. I'm just sharing what people told us. This woman who was attempting to take her own life, and she was taken to the hospital, and police were there, and she went to the bathroom, and her intention was to follow through. She still had pills, and she started taking them in the bathroom, and the police officer thought she was taking too long, so he forced the door open. And when he saw what she was doing, she described just so much compassion, he just reached down and gently took the pills out of her hand and said, sweetheart, you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this. And that was the first time that she described feeling that she was valued, that someone actually had some care for her. And that was the start. And from there it went. And there was a ton of work and a lot of ups and downs, but it was that one moment. And so, there are people with good hearts who are in our system. But what we learned is the system is not designed for that. It is a punitive system, and we need to have different people trained differently to address these issues.
We have I recently learned we have a police officer. I'm sure we have more than one here in Saskatoon who has a kind heart, but one that I know, his name's Officer Al, and he has a very strong rapport with our more vulnerable people in community. And there's countless stories I could tell about him, but maybe that's a topic for another show. Is there anything that we missed today? Is there anything else that you want to say before we put a lid on it?
Sure. Yeah, I think if people are interested in hearing more, they can sort of listen to. I have a podcast, not as widely listened to at all as yours, but no, it's not. Trust me. We just started out. It's a limited run thing, but it's people can hear for themselves the stories of people we interviewed. That's people who are survivors and victims, people who are incarcerated, people who work in and around the system. You know, we interviewed corrections officers. You hear from them. What are they saying? It's not just people incarcerated who think the system isn't working. Hear from a corrections officer, right?
What's the name of the podcast? Where can we find it?
Yeah, the podcast is the same as the book title. So it's Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial, and it's under my name, Benjamin Perrin, and it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major platforms. And whether it's the book or the podcast or events we're doing across Canada, all of that is on my website. It's just my name.ca, so benjaminperrin.ca.
All right. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, we'll see you again. All right, if you're getting something out of this episode, please hit that like button at the bottom of the screen. If you're not yet subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. We go live every Friday morning, every Sunday evening. We have tons of content, not unlike this episode today, for you to catch up on. That's it for now. Take care, everyone.
Say, this is Hard Knocks Talks.